This is a controversial topic, but it's a topic that should be, we should bring to a sense of scientific reasoning and economic reasoning and be open to the conversation. And that's what CEDA wants to provide, is a forum for that. I think for any society, the biggest long-term question it has to ask, and this goes back generations to all sorts of human civilization, is how are we going to get our energy? It's a very important question that every society has to answer. It's the driver of economic and social development. And it's a difficult question to answer in today's world where there's so many technological options and economic costs to consider, economic benefits to consider. It's a question we need to really confront and think about carefully. And today we have with us the opposition leader, the federal opposition leader, Mr. Peter Dutton, who is going to put to us this question: could a nuclear-powered Australia be the answer? Thank you very much for coming to CEDA for this. Thank you to everybody here and on the live stream for your engagement. Don't forget that you can ask questions via the Pigeonhole app using the QR code on the table. And when Chris Uhlmann then from Sky News comes up to talk to Mr. Dutton, he will facilitate your questions being asked and answered. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mr. Dutton.
Well, Sam, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. Can I start by saying thank you to Ted O'Brien for being here with me. He's had the joy of being appointed to the energy portfolio, and he's doing a sterling job. To the other distinguished guests, members of CEDA here today, thank you very much for your contribution to our public debate, our national debate. And as we know, energy isn't part of the economy, energy is the economy. And nobody less than Chris Uhlmann has made that fine point in at least one of his columns. Energy underpins and is vital to every sector. When energy costs are high, it's not only Australian homeowners and renters paying high power bills. Your supermarket pays more to refrigerate food. Your baker, your butcher and cafe pay more to run their business. Our farmers pay more to grow and harvest their crops. Our manufacturers pay more to produce and to package goods. Our builders pay more to construct homes. High power prices have inflationary impacts across the economy. That much we know. Higher costs are passed on to Australians, and that's happening right now. You end up paying more for every product, good and service. Cheap and consistent energy is critical for more affordable lives and a more prosperous economy into the future. The Labor Party and the Coalition have very different energy policies. The path Labor is on, with renewables only, in my judgment, is a dangerous one for our country. Labor's policy will cause even higher energy costs and an even more unstable grid than what we're seeing today. Labor's energy policy, along with its industry, IR and environment policies, are creating an economic perfect storm which is having a very negative impact on the economy. The Albanese government has us on a path towards the hollowing out of industry and business in our country. And it's all because of the Prime Minister's inability to make decisions around what is in our country's best interest, and instead putting ahead of that national interest a desire to stop voters going from the Labor Party to the Greens. Australians are doing it tough right now. Life will become even less affordable, we know, unless we course correct. The Coalition's energy policy is the only plan for cheaper, cleaner and consistent energy, and consequently safeguarding manufacturing, businesses and livelihoods. Australians want a sensible discussion about energy and energy policy, and it must be grounded in pragmatism, not politics. The Coalition, like other countries, sees renewables and nuclear as companions, not as competitors, as Labor does. And it's a false equation that the Treasurer and the Prime Minister are putting to you at the moment. Labor tells you that renewables and nuclear can't work together, but it's not credible. And consider the following examples and their energy mixes. In Arizona, there is 18% renewables, 26% nuclear, 48% gas, with the balance from coal. The Canadian province of Ontario has 8.5% renewables, 52% nuclear, 25% hydro, with the balance from gas. In France, it has 14% renewables, 64% nuclear, 10% hydro, again with the balance from gas and biomass. In Finland, it has 19% renewables, 38% nuclear, 17% hydro, with the balance from biomass, gas and coal. So the Coalition's policy, like many other countries, the policies that they've adopted, it's for an energy mix. Renewables firmed up by gas and nuclear. Today I want to highlight several reasons why Australia must include nuclear power in our mix. Labor's energy policy train wreck is only making it more vital that we include nuclear. So let me first provide 5 points on why the government's renewables-only approach is proving disastrous for our nation and doomed to fail. The first point is the international context. Nowhere in the world has a renewable-only policy worked. Wherever renewables are overbuilt and there's insufficient baseload firming power, the story is the same. One of skyrocketing costs of unreliable grids and energy rationing. California scaled up renewables, and drastically so over the past decade. As of May, wind and solar now account for more than 49% of its energy mix. Yet Californians pay the highest residential electricity prices on the United States mainland. Businesses are fleeing the state. California has seen the sharpest electricity price increase of any American state. Germany too has invested heavily in renewables, and wind and solar account for more than 30% of its mix. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, as we know, they cut off gas supplies to Europe, and Germany was left in a very precarious position. It ramped up its coal-fired power generation, and Germany will now spend about 16 billion euros on building 4 major gas plants to firm up its grid. This year alone, it's imported energy from nuclear-powered France equivalent to the output of 1.4 large reactors. And this leads to my second point, the technological constraints. On its own, weather-dependent energy cannot power a nation, including our own. Yes, we have an abundance of sun, but solar panels don't work at night, and we have windy regions, but we also have wind droughts, and turbines don't turn on their own. The best battery technology, which we all want to be better than what it is today, only provides a few hours of backup. So renewables must be firmed up. No country can run effectively on part-time power, on solar, wind and batteries alone. And yet the government is doubling down. It's rolling out intermittent sources of energy on an industrial scale, and it's removing 90% of essential 24/7 baseload power over the next decade, between now and 2034, with nothing to replace it. For all of the government's sweet talking about gas, it's stalling projects right now across the country. Which brings me to point number 3. A renewables-only approach is making our grid more unreliable and causing power prices to skyrocket. But don't just take our word for it. The energy regulator, AEMO, has warned that its blackouts this summer and power shortages on our east coast over coming years is something we need to factor in. As for prices, we'll consider South Australia. It has the largest penetration of renewables of any Australian state. South Australians are paying the highest cost for electricity in the country. And indeed, power bills across the country reveal the truth. Annual electricity bills for Australians haven't gone down by $275 as the Prime Minister promised at the last election. In fact, they've gone up by as much as $800 in the past 2 years. And one thing is sure, they will go up even further. Now, Jeff Dimery, the CEO of Alinta, didn't mince his words in a speech in April. He said, and I quote, "You came here for truths and straight talking about the transition, so here's a doozy. Australians will have to pay more for energy in the future." And he's right about Labor's approach. Engineer Dr. David Hayden Collins puts the renewables transition cost at about $1.3 trillion. Senior energy research scientist Dr. Chris Uhlmann puts the future figure as high as $1.5 trillion. And we know who's going to bear the cost of the transition. Australian households, small businesses, and the economy more generally, which will lead to higher power bills, and it'll lead to higher inflation. And it is a scandal that at the moment the government is I believe, consciously lying to the Australian people about the true costs they will bear in the years ahead under a renewables-only policy. The fourth point is feasibility. Labor's plan is for 82% renewables by 2030. In September of 22, Chris Bowen said that reaching that target would require installing 22,000 solar panels every day and 40 wind turbines every month through to 2030. In total, that's more than 58 million solar panels and around 3,500 wind turbines, which have lifespans of somewhere between 19 and 30 years. The energy transition will require rewiring the nation with up to 28,000 kilometres of new transmission lines. And how is it going to roll out? Well, the Clean Energy Council notes that some 7 gigawatts of large-scale renewable projects need to be committed to financially each and every year. And yet last year, it wasn't that figure, it was 1.3 gigawatts that were committed to, 80% below the government's own target. This year, as of 1 July, 1.6 gigawatts have been committed. And even if it doubles by year's end, it will be less than half of what's required. And the compounding effect here is felt by consumers and by investors. From Bunbury on the west coast to Port Stephens on the east coast, furious residents now are protesting about offshore wind farms, and that is due, in their judgment, to impacts on fishing, on tourism and livelihoods. So social licence is becoming a much bigger issue, particularly in these regional areas. In February and September, farmers came to Canberra to rally against the rollout of industrial-scale renewables and transmission lines on their prime agricultural land. It's clear that the government will not reach its 2030 target. Indeed, there is zero chance of the Albanese government reaching net zero by 2050 using renewables alone. Moreover, emissions are up, actually, since Labor's taken office. Now, the fifth point is that a renewables-only energy policy is an act of economic self-harm. Australia's power prices are sometimes double and even triple what other nations are paying. It's a reason why we've seen a threefold increase in the number of manufacturers who have closed their doors in our country in the last 2 years alone. It's a reason why we're seeing more and more businesses move their operations offshore. There's no chance of a future made in Australia in an environment where we don't have baseload energy and the support of those jobs. We lose that economic activity due to exorbitant energy prices. And all that happens, of course, is that we just simply end up having to import that finished product back into our country, often at a higher cost, without the job creation and with more emissions into the global environment. Global emissions won't be lower under that model. They'll be produced in other countries, in Malaysia, in parts of Africa, and they will have weaker environmental laws and standards than we do in our country. So, ladies and gentlemen, we do need to have an honest conversation with the Australian public. Energy is the economy, and you cannot run a full-time and functioning economy using part-time and unreliable power. If our national goals are for cheaper, cleaner and consistent energy, then Australia must join the growing league of nuclear-powered nations. As I've said before, nuclear energy in Australia is an idea whose time has come. So let me make a few points on why Australia needs and must have nuclear power into our energy mix. Firstly, again, is the international context. Nuclear power works. It's a proven decades-old technology. More than 400 reactors operate worldwide today. More than 30 countries use nuclear power. Dozens of more nations are looking to introduce it for the first time. We know that Russia, China, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, many other nations are using the nuclear propulsion system for their submarines. And the collective might of that research and development, the billions of dollars spent each year on research and development, will translate in future generations of the nuclear technology, which will bring down prices and provide further reliability. Australia is the only country in the top 20 economies that is not using zero emissions nuclear power or taking steps to put it into the mix. The next point is that nuclear is the only form of baseload power that meets all three of our national energy goals. Wherever nuclear power is a part of a country's energy mix, it provides affordable electricity. Canadians in Ontario and Americans in Tennessee pay about 18 cents a kilowatt hour. That's 3 times less than what some Australian households pay today. Joe Biden, Justin Trudeau, Keir Starmer and leaders from the left of politics. Emmanuel Macron claims to be a centrist. I think he's a little further left than maybe he wants you to believe, but nonetheless, let's call him a centrist. All 4 champion nuclear power because of its ability to provide 24/7 power. President Biden said that nuclear power is the biggest source of clean energy. He said America is, and I quote, keeping existing plants open, restarting shuttered plants, and building America's first new nuclear plants in decades. Prime Minister Trudeau said that Canada's baseload energy requirements over the coming decades will require doing much more nuclear. Baseload power is critical in all of those economies, and it is in ours. To grow sovereign industries, to meet electricity demands of a bigger population, to accommodate energy-intensive data centres and greater use of AI. We hear a lot about moral obligations in the energy debate. I want a better environment for our future generations by adopting cleaner energy. But I also want our children to inherit a prosperous economy underpinned by cheaper and consistent energy. And we can have cheaper, cleaner and consistent energy if we adopt nuclear power. And zero-emission nuclear power is our only chance to reach net zero by 2050. John Kerry said this: "We can't get to net zero 2050 unless we have a pot, a mixture of energy approaches in the new energy economy. And one of those elements which is essential in all the modelling I've seen is nuclear." Now, my third point is that nuclear power is better for our environment. We can maximise the highest yield of energy per square metre of environmental impact and minimise environmental damage. And this is the key argument that Bill Gates pushes. Now look at the example of the UAE, who recently completed its first nuclear power plant with an output of 5.6 gigs, enough to supply 60% of power to New South Wales. It takes 52 million solar panels to generate the same amount of energy. But the energy is only available, as we know, when the sun is shining. And the footprint difference is telling. Some 617 acres for that nuclear plant in UAE, some 192,000 acres for the solar panels. In other words, the nuclear plant delivers the same energy using less than 1% of the land needed for solar. The Coalition's plan is to place the latest nuclear technologies in 7 locations on the sites of retiring coal-fired power stations. And that brings me to the next point of cost. Under our approach, we can use the existing transmission network at those sites. The poles and wires are already in existence and they shouldn't be stranded assets. With nuclear, there's no need to carpet our landscape and coastline with industrial-scale solar and wind farms, or indeed the 28,000 kilometres of new transmission lines needed to make them work and distribute that energy. Now, our nuclear plan requires a significant upfront cost, and you can look at the international examples to see as much. But a whole new and vast transmission network and infrastructure won't be needed under the plan that we're putting forward. Moreover, the cost of our nuclear plants can be amortised and spread over a reactor's 80-year lifespan. Under Labor's renewables only plan, every solar panel and wind turbine will not only need to be replaced 3 to 4 times over the same period, all of it will end up in landfill, a conversation our country so far hasn't discussed. We'll release our costings in due course at a time of our choosing. I know Chris Bowen believes he's running this debate, but he's not. And we'll provide more detail on many elements, and Ted is working on that. Our policy that we put forward will be a fraction of the cost of the Labor Party's $1.2 to $1.5 trillion plan. That much should be obvious to all Australians. But we're spending taxpayers' money more efficiently. And just as we were upfront about the locations of our nuclear sites, and as we've seen in the debate so far, the government hasn't been able to dispute those 7 sites that we've put forward. We'll have more information about the cost of nuclear. We'll have it in good time. It will be independently verified, and it will show a cost differential which is significant in favour of nuclear coming into the mix. It's an investment our nation can and must undertake. But I can give you this guarantee. Our nuclear plan will be reliable, it will be based on the best technology, as I say, it will be a fraction of that cost. It will be better for our environment. We won't be ripping up agricultural land. We won't be treating Australians differently depending on whether they live in the city or in the country. And we want to make sure that we roll that plan out in a responsible way with support from stakeholders, and we need people to join this debate. And as I say, it doesn't require us to rip up that farming land. I think this is a very important point, and at the moment we're seeing a lot of interruption for those regional communities. And I don't think it should be not remarked on today. Chris Bowen's latest modelling on nuclear power, I think, is an attempt to manipulate and mislead Australians. If you believe his latest modelling, let me remind you about Labor's modelling history. Labor's modelling said you would get a 275 reduction to your power bill each year. We know how that's turned out. Labor introduced one of the world's most punitive new carbon taxes without doing any modelling on its impact to the economy. If you're looking who to trust on energy prices, remember the track record. In almost 12 years of the Howard government, electricity prices went up by 2.2% per year, abstracting from the impact of the GST at the time, around 99-2000. In almost 9 years of the last coalition government, electricity prices went up by 0.3% per year. In the 6 years of the Rudd-Gillard government, electricity prices went up by 12.9% per year. Under the Albanese government, raw electricity prices have gone up by 14% per year. And the final point I'll make about nuclear power is the opportunity before us. There is bipartisan support for Australia's acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. That includes the disposal of their waste and end-of-life reactors on our soil. That's been signed up to by the Albanese government. Accordingly, any objections to a civil nuclear industry on the grounds of safety and waste disposal are inconsistent and illogical. Just as nuclear technology is safe for our submariners, it's safe for our citizens, and that's the international experience. As it is for thousands of people in other countries who live near or around the industry and the reactors. And frankly, Australians deserve much better than childish scare campaign memes depicting three-eyed fish and koalas. Australians aren't stupid, and they saw straight through it. Overseas, those communities that host nuclear plants have become centres for new industries, for manufacturing and for investment. And Australia will be no different. More than 75% of coal plant workers have skills and experience which are transferable to nuclear plants. But each nuclear plant will create hundreds or thousands of new jobs too. New industries will flourish. Thousands of jobs will be created. It will set our country and our manufacturing sectors up for generations to come. And clean nuclear energy is reliable. It will underpin renewables. It will get the cost of electricity down. It will keep the lights on. And the opportunity for Labor now is to put down the juvenile arguments against nuclear. The opposition has supported changes to the NDIS because it's in our country's best interest to do so, not because there's a political dividend from it. We've supported significant changes to aged care for exactly the same reason. It was economically the responsible thing to do. Not necessarily electorally popular, but we joined with the government in a bipartisan spirit. And the test for Labor now, the test for Anthony Albanese, is whether he will put aside the juvenile attacks and join us in what should be an undertaking that is transformational for our economy. Transformation of our energy system is significant. It's as significant as the Hawke-Keating and Howard Costello economic reforms of the 80s, 90s and 2000s. Let me conclude on this point. We can't switch nuclear power on tomorrow, even if the ban was lifted overnight. But like other countries, we need to ramp up our domestic gas production in the more immediate term to get power prices down and to restore stability to our grid. But what we can do is also ensure that Australia doesn't miss the nuclear train. The Coalition's desire to see Australia become a nuclear-powered country is in our national interest. It is truly visionary, and it's a policy unlike any put forward by a political party this century. It's testimony to a determination to move beyond the short-termism which has been defined by so much of the policy making, not just here, but in Western democracies in recent decades. It's a resolve to put pragmatism ahead of politics, and that's what the Australian people will get from a government that I lead. They will get economic security, national security, and energy security. We need business on this journey. We need people to speak, as they are in private at the moment, about the concerns that they have with the energy system, the energy mix, the policy decisions being made. And we need people to have those conversations in the public square. So I'm so pleased that you're all able to be here with me today and with Ted O'Brien. We look forward to embarking on the next stage of this journey together, and I'm very grateful for your presence here today. Thank you.
Mr Dutton, thank you very much for the speech. We do have the ability to ask questions from the floor, so please get in and ask your questions. Just so you know, up front, I'll go in the order of votes that they get, so if you're not asking one, then vote for one and we'll do that. I just have a few quick questions off the top, and you know, quick questions and quick answers, I think is probably a good thing. We get through as many as we possibly can. The first stumbling point is nuclear energy is illegal, not just at a federal level, but at a state level. Under what iteration of the future do you imagine that those bans will be lifted?
Well, Chris, nobody could have imagined that AUKUS was possible because the Labor Party had always been against a nuclear submarine. It was possible because we had the ability to negotiate the deal with the United States and the United Kingdom. We did the deal, it's supported on a bipartisan basis in the United States and in the United Kingdom. And Labor, to its credit in opposition, under Anthony Albanese's leadership, signed up to the AUKUS deal. Now that's why now we've moved on from the debate about safety and disposal. The government has accepted that it is a safe technology and that disposal is possible in our country. So I think on the basis of, as Sam pointed out before, if you're talking about a scientific-based approach, if you're looking at the facts as opposed to the emotion, if you're looking at the international experience and what is in our country's best interests, I don't believe that you can arrive at a different conclusion. It's why Peter Malinauskas is fully signed up to nuclear in South Australia with the Osborne docking of the nuclear submarines, the work that will take place on the reactors. A similar story for the Labor government in Western Australia, where at the port in Henderson, they're going to be into an indefinite period, for decades to come, tying up nuclear submarines there, working on those nuclear submarines. Again, that puts the question of safety beyond doubt. And I think with South Australia, we could strike a deal very quickly. The only reservation Peter Malinauskas has expressed about nuclear is in relation to cost, and I believe that we can deal with those concerns in due course.
Since you raised it, I've been to Plant Vogel in the United States. It started in the year 2009 to build 2 plants. I'm very supportive of nuclear energy, but it is undoubtedly expensive. It cost $30 billion US. The last plant was only commissioned this year. So how do you deal with the cost issue, which is a central issue to this debate?
Well, Chris, we're not talking about being the first type, not being first in class. We can look at the international experience, look at what the Koreans are doing, look at what has happened in the UAE, look at Westinghouse and the AP1000s, and what's happened in the United States as recently as May, the 4th unit there commissioned, and look at what's happening in France and elsewhere. We don't need to build a bespoke reactor. We can rely on the proven technologies. And if we do that, we can avoid some of the initial cost and time blowouts that are a feature of a newest technology. That's not what we're proposing. We're not proposing to reinvent the wheel here. We want to learn from and benefit from the international experience. And if you contrast either the capital cost or the OPEX in relation to nuclear, it is much cheaper than what the government's proposing at the moment. We're a fraction of the $1.2 trillion of Labor's plan.
But there is no cheap energy future, is it? What Jeff Demery said is true, whether it's you or whether it's the government, electricity prices are going to rise in the near term and possibly the long term.
Well, but Chris, look at the international experience. Again, in Ontario, a third of the cost of electricity that we're paying here today. We have a high wage cost in our country and nobody's proposing to reduce wages. We have 3 levels of government. Well, there probably are people here who are suggesting that we should eliminate at least 1 level of government, and you can take your pick on different days, but we're not going to reduce the compliance cost and the regulatory burden to the point that can make us internationally competitive to comparable nations. We can try and we can reduce part of it, but it's an inbuilt cost. The one area, in my judgment, that we could say to the entire economy that we can reduce that input cost is in energy. We have an abundance of natural resource. We have the world crying out for minerals, for uranium, and we have a capacity here to bring the cost of electricity down, to transition, to decarbonise as we must, particularly as a trading nation. We're not talking about not having renewables in the system, but a whole renewable policy is going to end in disaster, and that's why I think if we look at the international example around cost, we should take some comfort from that.
One last thing from me before we go to the floor. How are you going to bring down the price of gas? Because essentially in the Australian marketplace at the moment, what is happening is that renewable energy is creating scarcity at peak times of the day, and gas is setting the wholesale power price, and the price of gas is high. How could you possibly get it down in the near term?
Well, you need to bring more supply on, there's no question about that. And there is an abundance of supply. There are projects ready to go, and we need to have more gas into the system. Now, the Teals and others will say that gas must be stopped immediately. Well, our economy closes down. That's the reality. And if you are in Labor's shoes at the moment, you don't like coal, you don't like gas, green hydrogen's not a reality, certainly not a commercial reality. You don't like nuclear. When Chris Bowen talks about an energy gap opening up over the next decade or two, the biggest risk is in Labor's model because they don't have a baseload power. They can talk about hydro, they can talk about batteries, but they don't have the storage ability and they don't have the generation capacity without gas. And the government says one thing on the West Coast and something very different in the inner city seats here in Sydney and in Melbourne, but you do need more gas, and we've been very clear about our desire to improve the approval processes while still being environmentally responsible and bringing more of those projects on more quickly.
All right, we'll go to the floor, and just so in case anyone asks, as people always do, I'm going to go with those ones that are getting the most votes from the floor. At the moment, leading by a long way was Peter with 11 votes on how much debt did Ontario take on to develop a nuclear industry, and while the world is building more nuclear reactors, how many have been built by Western nations this century?
Well, if you have a look at the Biden administration, what's just happened in the United States with, after some time delay and certainly a lot of expense, and again, it comes back to the first type and issues that Westinghouse, etc. had. You can have a look at the peculiarities of that case. But as the technology, as you move past number one, it becomes more affordable, more realistic. And in the case of Ontario, look at the user price today. So taking all of the systems costs into account, which we don't in this country at the moment. There's a dishonest debate about what it costs us to change wind turbines out every 19 years if they're offshore. The millions of dollars that go into the servicing, the landfill, the impact that it has. So I think when you look at it on a comparable basis, we can look not just to the United States and to Europe as we would, but look to Asia and elsewhere. And if 19 of the top 20 economies in the world are on this pathway and we're the only one, then I think your questions around cost will be dealt with.
Just a question on that though, to add to that question, it is Ontario did take on a huge public debt. You would be, even though you're not giving us a figure at the moment, we're looking at something between $250 billion and $500 billion, aren't we?
Well, I'm not going into the figures now, we'll release all of that, but the fact is that you end up with a much cheaper per unit cost under nuclear over time because of the amortisation period. And as I said before, with the collective billions of dollars going into research and development from all of those nations, west and east, all of that will translate into the next generation of power. It's inconceivable that countries in our own region, in Fiji and the Solomon Islands, in Papua New Guinea and elsewhere, will continue to rely on diesel generators that get turned off at 8 or 9 o'clock at night in some instances. They want to have a thriving and growing economy, and Australia risks, frankly, being left behind in pretty poor company. And I'd prefer to look at what's happening in the US, in Canada, in France, and many other countries around the world that we should be seeking to emulate, not the lowest common denominator.
Question from Giles Parkinson, who asks, what will the Coalition build to fill the gap as coal retires, and why will that not need new transmission?
Well, coal is going to stay in the system for a lot longer under what Labor's proposing. And at the moment, as we know, the New South Wales and Victorian state Labor governments are negotiating contracts with coal-fired generators to extend the life of those assets. That's the reality of what's happening today. Now, they don't talk about it, they don't want it publicly highlighted, but that's the reality. And so, as I said before, gas is going to be a huge feature. Renewables, fully supportive of renewables, but we also need to have an eye on the environmental impact. And at the moment, we're subverting environmental approval processes to find an outcome for some projects, where I think the social licence is starting to evaporate in some of those communities, and I think we need to deal with that reality as well. So there are a lot of moving parts.
Okay, question from Rob. Please enumerate the quantitative evidence that you have to back up your claim that nuclear power will deliver lower prices than renewable energy.
Well, I cited some of the nations and their lived experience. So again, part of the problem in our country, and it was when we were contemplating whether we would do the AUKUS deal or not, go with a nuclear-powered submarine. Our country is off a zero knowledge base in terms of nuclear compared to France, for example, or Canada, or the United States or elsewhere. And if we look to the international experience, which I think is instructive, you can see the cost per kilowatt, per gig, depending on what part of the equation you're looking at. You can see the end cost. You can see the amortisation periods. You can see where the research and development money is going. And that's the reality of it.
A question from Giles Parkinson. The countries that you cite as having habitable nuclear and RE have no more than 18% renewables. Australia will soon be at 50%, it's actually at 40% at the moment. Will you seek to cap renewables at that level?
No, I think what we want to achieve is an outcome where we have a proper mix, where we have an eye on price. At the moment, it seems for many debates in this country around different infrastructure projects, investment into renewables, whatever it might be, that we've lost a sense of what the end user is paying. And the assumption is that margins will just be squeezed, which means that less projects get up, or that the end consumer will just pay exponentially more for their power or for the end service or good that they're being provided with. And my view is that we should be talking about not just transition and reliability, but that we should be talking about cost. And that's something that we want to generate as part of this debate, because if you look at, for example, green hydrogen, you've seen what Andrew Forrest has done in terms of moving his own money. You've seen what's happening in Japan and international markets otherwise in relation to green hydrogen. I'd love it to be a reality tomorrow, but it's not. It uses an enormous amount of water. It's expensive to pump the water. It's expensive to move the water. And there is limited social licence in the projects that they're talking about that would support literally millions of solar panels. Those communities won't accept it. So renewables absolutely in the system, but I think you make a judgment on that as we bring nuclear into the system.
Just before I go back to the pad, what are you hearing about demand? Because just in the United States and talking to the regulators there, one of them told me that they're now getting demands from data centres for 1 gigawatt of power. And as he said, putting that in perspective, that is the equivalent of putting a San Francisco on the grid. And so are you hearing from people that their expectations of what energy needs that we'll need in future are severely underdone?
Yeah, certainly. And I think the AI and data centres is a really interesting study here. We're a country with low or limited sovereign risk. We have a governance arrangement that's the envy of much of the world. We have stable policy settings, generally speaking, even though, as I said before, the 3 levels of government can bring a cost with all of that. We are a natural home for data storage, and for countries, for companies to look to us in the defence space, in health, in storage of personal data otherwise. But it comes with an enormous power usage, and so yes, the companies are talking about much greater usage across the networks, and there's no question about that. And we see, I read the same article, in the United States, 1 gig at a time, when you see what Apple is doing, going into nuclear at their data centres, or that desire, and many other companies as well. The reality of AI is that it is going to need that baseload power. It's not going to rely on intermittent power. It's not going to rely on the storage capacity that we have now. And I think Australia has a huge play here, And at the moment, I think we're playing ourselves out of that game.
A question from Eric Campbell from Four Corners, and has come up with the vote, and he can now never say that...
Four Corners.
Four Corners, but he can now never say that I've never done him any favours. The Vogel nuclear plant in Georgia has just installed 2 AP1000 reactors, your preferred model for Australia, and the power prices have doubled. So how can you guarantee bills will come down?
Well, firstly, I mean, there are a number of things that you could deal with there, because when Four Corners talks about the Coalition's preferred model, we've said no such thing. We've cited the example of the AP1000. We've talked about small modular reactors. We've talked about the experience in UAE, and we'll have more to say about the energy mix within each of those 7 sites. First point. Second point is, if you look at the amortisation period and you look at the capital investment that's required, I'd say to Four Corners, look at what's happening in Ontario. Look at what's happening in California at the other end of the spectrum. Look at what's happening elsewhere, where the energy is not only providing reliability, it's underpinning renewables and it's delivering energy at a lower cost.
This one is about amortising, and you say the cost of nuclear will be amortised over 80 years. Who will finance on those terms? Have you ever tried to get an 80-year home loan? As I understand it, the government will be paying for it. Is that...
But our judgment is that it should be a government asset. There are a number of reasons for that, not just around the finances, but also in relation to safety and regulation. And I think that's the best starting point for us, and we've been clear about that. Ted's done a lot of work in this regard as well. We've done a lot of work with economists and a lot of work with modellers to look at how that best works. And but in terms of, you know, I mean, sort of a juvenile point about not being able to get a home loan for 80 years, I mean, you can't build a toll road because you can't get a toll road loan for 80 years. There are many capital markets, players in capital markets who are clamouring over each other to invest in those sort of long-held assets with stable returns. So there's capital there, as we're seeing around the world. In the United States, the example that was cited before with the Westinghouse product, or the AP1000s, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, the left-wing government of the United States, the Biden administration, has put in something like $13 billion into underpinning the construction of at least Unit 4, if not Unit 3 as well.
Yeah, I went to the Vogel plant, as I said, and it was opened by the US Energy Secretary, and she said of the plant, 2 down, 198 to go when it came to the Biden administration. There, by the way, there is bipartisan support in the United States for nuclear energy. This is from John Rolfe, why didn't the Morrison, Turnbull or Abbott coalition governments that you're a key member of seek to establish zero emissions nuclear power plants?
Because I don't believe it was possible before the AUKUS deal. Labor gave up any pretence of being concerned about safety when they signed up to AUKUS. And it was a difficult debate before that. Bob Hawke looked very closely at it and, you know, up until his death was a very strong supporter of nuclear. We know that there are many people within Labor ranks, including the union ranks, who are strong supporters of the nuclear industry in our country. We sought bipartisan support from the Labor Party. We were never obviously going to get it from the Greens, but we sought it from the Labor Party because that was part of our negotiation with the US. And I don't think the US would have signed up to AUKUS without there being a bipartisan position. And therefore, if under AUKUS you're saying that nuclear technology is safe for submariners to sleep alongside, and for those submarines, as I said before, to come into Australian ports, to be within a stone's throw of residential housing and populations of Australians, if you think that's safe, you give up that argument. If you have signed up under AUKUS to dispose of waste at end of life, you have made a decision that it is safe to do so. And therefore, why not a domestic nuclear industry? And then we come down to locations. We've identified the 7 locations. The government has had no pushback on those sites whatsoever. And then we come down ultimately to the final issue, which is cost. And we're moving into that debate now. But what I think the government's demonstrated over the course of the last couple of weeks, where they've sought to focus in on cost, is that they've said to Australians, we're not concerned about safety. We're not concerned about disposal. And it would be very dishonest of the Prime Minister to suggest that it would be unsafe to have a small modular reactor here on an end-of-life coal-fired power station site in New South Wales or wherever it might be that we've identified, when you've signed up to the technology, the same technology under AUKUS.
Just an interesting fact too about the Vogel power plants. They've been designed after September 11, so they're designed to withstand the direct impact of the 747. So it's just interesting in terms of security. This quote from Sophia Walter: given nuclear would make up less than 4% of electricity, what's the rest of the energy plan?
Well, again, I don't know where that figure comes from because it's not credible. There needs to be a mix of gas, there needs to be renewables. Coal will be in the system for longer than what Labor Party's acknowledging at the moment because they're signing those contracts to do that. And there will be, in our judgment, nuclear in the system because green hydrogen is not going to be a commercial reality. And as I say, if you accept that you need baseload power, which surely Chris Uhlmann does, what is the replacement for the 90% moving out of the system by 2034?
This one from Alex G, and I think this is a question for everyone, opposition and government. To challenge the concern on the slow build-out of renewables, what would you propose as the medium-term solution, noting nuclear can take many years to develop and build? And this is really the pinch point for really your government or the Labor government is a gap is opening up between supply and demand right now.
Well, Chris, that's true, and that's why they're extending the life of coal-fired power stations now, because they realise the economy falters without it. We don't have an energy system at the moment without coal and gas. That's just the reality. And the Allen government in Victoria can pretend that they don't need gas. They're about to import gas by ship into Victoria to keep the economy running. Businesses are leaving Victoria and going to South Australia and elsewhere, even if they're paying higher prices because they're worried about the unreliability that the Allen government's introducing into the economy. Which is an outrage. And we do need to have a focus on cost, of course. As I point out, I think it's been absent the debate in many ways. But we also need to make sure that we're making investment decisions excuse me, that provide that incentive for renewables to go into the system. But renewables will not provide the baseload 24/7 power that we need.
Further to Alex's question too, I think we have 16 coal-fired power plants left on the national electricity market on the east coast of Australia. Eraring's life is being extended. How long can you keep these facilities open, given that we're flogging a 40 or 50 or 60-year-old clapped-out hole from as hard as it can go and asking it to do things it was never required to do before, which is to cycle up and down through the course of the day to meet the peaks and the troughs of renewable energy?
Well, there's a variability, as you'd expect, because some have come on more recently than others. Some have been maintained more efficiently than others. And I think at the moment, some of the companies are seeing, frankly, a negotiation where the other party's in distress. And I suspect they're quite significant plays for some of the companies that may involve upgrades or refurbishments, but it's a case-by-case basis as you go around the country. Some of the plants aren't scheduled to come out of service until the late 2030s, 2040s in any case.
Yeah, I think the last one was Loy Yang B in 2049. This from me in motto, and this is a great question. Do you ever foresee a day when energy policy will be largely bipartisan, agreed and supported in the same way that defence policy is, given its long-term criticality?
Well,
are you an optimist?
Well, Chris, interestingly, in the United Kingdom, and they've just had an election, the Labor Party were fiercely critical of the Tories there because they hadn't put enough nuclear into the mix. And Labor went to the election in the United Kingdom, I think in a responsible way, saying that they were going to increase the amount of nuclear energy into the mix. If you look at the most recent COP, all of those countries I cited before, France, the United States, the United Kingdom, all committed to putting more nuclear into the mix. It's a bipartisan position in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in France. And nobody's disputing the juvenile approaches in a way that the government is doing so at the moment. We need to have a mature conversation, and I believe that the government is driven by, as I said before, and you've seen it in other policy responses recently, where they're more concerned about the domestic impact and whether it's going to drive people from the Labor Party to the Greens. And the threat in Anthony Albanese's seat is not from us. Liberal Party won't win Grainler. He's dead worried about the Greens because the Greens hold the local council divisions, they hold the state government seat, and they're worried desperately about losing seats like that to the Greens. And unfortunately, our national interest is running second, and that is not a feature in the United States where the Democrats and Republicans are committed to the Inflation Reduction Act and their commitment to nuclear as they are in Canada and France.
All right, look, if you've already asked one question, I'm going to go to other questions because you've had a chance. So Melanie Becker says, is it too late? The time it will take to get the benefits of nuclear, many countries are moving towards the renewables for this reason, she says.
I just don't think it is. And again, if there is any lesson to be taken out of the current international debate, it is countries who are starting off a zero base now. Now, there are some countries, I cited Germany before, who can rely on France, and they can say, well, we're not a nuclear country, but they're taking nuclear from France, or other examples you could cite, to keep their system going. They're not opposed to renewables, they're not opposed to other energy sources in the mix, but they're relying on nuclear. Now, that's an option for Europe, for many European nations to adopt that model, and it's financially beneficial for the generator to be able to do that. In our country, we don't have that opportunity because as an island nation, we're not able to rely on others as we know can happen in Europe. So I think we have to make the step. I think we're better off to make it sooner than later. I think it can happen on a bipartisan position. I do think it's transformational for our economy. And I think if the Prime Minister can get past the weakness of the current approach and dispense with the short-termism around the political opportunity domestically, then I think there is a coming together opportunity. As I said before, that we did in aged care. People said that there couldn't be agreement in aged care. There was, because we negotiated with the government for a period of 6 months. And in my judgment, that's what made John Howard successful in opposition, because he was able to support the economic framework being put forward by the Hawke-Keating government, which otherwise wouldn't have got through. We supported the NDIS, as I pointed out before, and as I said, to Anthony's great credit, they supported AUKUS from opposition, which wasn't an easy position. But having done that, the opportunity now, the obligation, I think, on the Labor Party is to join us in a factually based conversation and allow people to make a judgment about it. The latest news poll results show that 2/3 of people aged between 18 and 34 strongly support nuclear into the mix, because they know, as is happening in Europe, we cannot achieve our emissions reductions targets without having nuclear in the mix. And we're more economically responsible in doing so.
Just look at the plan for AEMO put out, which is the integrated system plan. Gas is in the system until 2050 and beyond. 15 gigawatts has to be built. Which transmission projects, Peter asks, would you cancel if you come into office? How will you convince state governments who are now building that it's an economically smart move?
Well, again, if you take the example of South Australia, or even here in New South Wales, I think Premier Minns is pragmatic and sensible in relation to a number of policy debates that he's involved in at the moment. I think there is an arrangement that can be struck very quickly with state governments who I think are pragmatic. In private, there are many in the Labor Party who are tearing their hair out at the approach of the government, which is being dictated to by the Greens, and I think we can find those arrangements, and I think in collaboration with the states and territories, with the premiers and chief ministers, you can look around the country as to what the mix looks like and what level of investment is required. And I think that is a much more, not just pragmatic approach, but an economically sensible approach to the next 3, 4, 5, 6 decades out through the next century.
All right, Christian Zur asks, how do you account for the massive time and cost blowouts that have occurred internationally, such as the Hinkley Point and Vogel, and would you be able to build these assets in time to replace coal?
Well, Chris, you cited the situation with AP1000, and you can look at other projects. There was something like, and Ted will know this figure much better than I, but there was something like 19 variations done to the structure of that, because it was first in type, right? And you'd expect that. The same with shipbuilding or submarine building. The costs always get blown out. The timelines always get blown out. But if you look at the experiences from Unit 3 to Unit 4, they've cut down dramatically, not just the cost, but the timeline as well. And that is again, I mean, anybody who's supposing or advocating that we should start with the kangaroo brand nuclear reactor, that's nothing of what we're talking about. Look at the international experiences, and I think we can do well from it.
We must make an end, but one last quick question and answer. Sally asked, why does the Coalition believe that nuclear is going to have less of a social licence problem than renewables?
Because there is a much bigger energy IQ, and it's really interesting to look at the research of this. Not just the younger people who are most concerned in the polling about the transition to net zero. It's really interesting when you look at the view of coal miners and workers in those plants. They know that there is nothing coming once that plant closes down. A renewables project with some jobs at the margins, as opposed to a proposal where you can attract data storage, and you can attract heavy industry, and you can attract heavy energy users into that region, and the thousands of jobs flow from it. And again, that's what's happened. I mean, in the United States, you've got regions bidding for this technology because they know that it's what's going to underpin car manufacturing or investment into steel manufacturing or whatever the case might be. And that's, I think, something that we should also focus on, because there is strong community support in many of those regions. And off a zero base, as I said before, I think this debate has progressed incredibly successfully in a short period of time. The government tried to run the safety issue to start with. I think Malinauskas and others slapped them down. And we come now to a cost discussion, which is a very worthy discussion. But the international experience is going to mean that we can deliver it more cheaply here, and we can learn in a way that's going to underpin our economy. Without it, I don't know what the answer is, because there is not a proven technology. Batteries that last now, the best batteries that we can spend hundreds of millions of dollars on today will last for 4 hours. But the problem for that equation is that there are 24 hours in the day. We need to recharge the batteries, which requires an overbuild. And if we have wind droughts and we have extended periods of inclement weather, the batteries will not cut it.
Just very quickly, we will get your entire plan before the federal election, and
Absolutely.
It will be costed.
Yes.
Okay, great. Look, can I thank the audience of CEDA, and particularly for Mr. Dutton. I don't think that the audience could be accused of giving you an easy time, and thank you for being here and answering questions. And I thank Jo, who one of her desires is that this organisation conducts civilised conversations, civilised adult conversations. Thanks everyone for being here today and doing that, because it's a conversation which must be had. So thanks again.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris, for your facilitation. And Mr. Dutton, thank you very much for bringing your first real public conversation on this topic in such an expansive way to us here at CEDA. A lot of takeaways from that from all of us, but I think your plea really that this shouldn't be an ideological question. This is a question of facts and of costing and of data and of thinking very long term. Somebody somewhere is going to have to run the 80-year NPV on this. And obviously doing an 80-year NPV in a 3-year electoral cycle is a challenge, but it's something that we all as Australians need to think through those cycles and think very long term. So thank you so much for the clarity of the presentation today, and to everyone for your questions, your challenging questions, and really pushing for what's going to come next. We look forward to the rest of that discussion. We at CEDA are very grateful to have all of you here and to be able to facilitate that. A quick mention for a couple more events coming up for CEDA. Another long-term question on Thursday the 31st of October, tax reform laying the foundations. Obviously a very important long-term question. And then there's a keynote address on the 4th of November, Monday the 4th of November, by Frank Calabria from Origin Energy. So obviously very topical as well. Thank you so much to everybody. Again, to Mr. Dutton and to Chris, thank you very much. And have a good day, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.